to welcome you all to the launch of a very, very important book, The Right to Sanitation in India, Critical Perspectives. Many, many congratulations to my colleague Philip Goulet and his co-authors on putting together this fantastic volume. I have been witness to the evolution of this book over the last few years, and have had the privilege of sitting in on some of the conversations and the author workshops. I have to say, I learned a lot from my interactions with the authors and the editors, and through the discussions on sanitation. And so this is most certainly a book that must be read. And a very special thank you and warm welcome to our panelists who agreed to be here to discuss the book today. I think this book is particularly important not only for the critical perspective, as it says, that it brings on sanitation, but also because it comes at a time when India is, I think, just emerging from this 5 years of a very focused attempt at achieving the goal of total sanitation through the Swachh Bharat mission. And I think that one of the challenges of a mission-oriented, target-oriented program is that in the rush to meet the mission and to meet the goals and targets, one forgets that in fact provision of public services is not a matter of implementing schemes. The provision of public services is very much about the realization of fundamental social and economic rights. It is fundamentally about the relationship between citizens and the state, and it is about ensuring that the state fulfills its duties and obligations towards its citizens. And one important duty and obligation is the articulation of public services as a fundamental right. It is a right for citizens to access sanitation services, not something that the government is forcing, coercing, and pushing citizens to adopt in order to meet goals and targets. And I think that as we celebrate the achievements of the last 5 years, and one must not take away from that, we have put sanitation front and center on the map of social policy. We are talking about it. Some movement has been made in achieving the target of open defecation. But one must remember that this is about ensuring that rights of citizens are met rather than meeting goals set by policymakers. And so it is in that context that I think this book is really very important, and a very important contribution from scholars at CPR in the public policy domain. CPR is an institution that straddles the world of academia and policy making, I think one of the most important contributions that we seek to make is through our academic work to problematize the process of policy making and ask hard questions of our policymakers. This may not necessarily lend itself to carefully crafted, bite-sized, quick solutions to the wicked problems that policy in India faces, but I think it is important to challenge perspectives, and it is important to present critical understandings of policy ideas and the bite sizes that it necessarily has to convert itself into, in order that the process of policy making becomes much more sensitive and sensitized to the realities in which it unfolds, and far more thoughtful than it tends to be in the day-to-day hustle and bustle of meeting policy goals and looking for technocratic solutions. And I believe that this book is an important contribution in precisely that direction. Thank you once again for being here. I should also say that this book is part of a wider engagement that we within CPR have on the question of sanitation. We have a large program called Sci-Fi. Like all our former chairperson said, India does development by acronyms, and therefore we have adopted that particular element of policy making at CPR too. So we have acronyms for all our big initiatives. Sci-Fi stands for something so complicated that even I can't remember it offhand. But really it's about urban sanitation. It's less complicated. It's about urban sanitation, and it again touches on some of the difficult questions of urban sanitation, including, importantly, the question of inclusion and specifically the issue of manual scavenging and sanitation. We have another initiative called AI, which is easier to articulate because I coined that accountability initiative, that has been looking at the implementation of Swachh Bharat Rural, trying to understand how focused, mission mode, target driven, everything that you get taught in public policy schools as the first principles of how to get policy right, gets implemented on the ground. And we've taken it upon ourselves to understand what gets taught in classrooms and what gets planned on paper in New Delhi doesn't actually necessarily articulate itself to perfection on the ground, and ground realities and interactions there shape implementation, and that shaping is very central to how mission mode targeted programs, in fact, in some senses, perhaps on paper are furthering rights, but could on many occasions serve to undermine rights of citizens in the process. So it is a complex world of policy in which our sanitation work is also trying to hold a mirror, and look for comprehensive solutions. So thank you all for being here this evening, and can I invite Felipe up on stage so that we can launch the book? You must come right in the center.
The only speaker is okay, but then Sujit can also come.
Yeah, you have two editors here. Three of us are writers together. Yeah. You have to only read the title. Page like this. So we see the movie afterwards. So, Usha, over to you. Okay. Thank you very much, Yamini. We are missing, Sujit is the other editor, we are missing the third editor, Loveleen Muller. And the amount of work that they've done and how difficult it is to get a book like this out, I think we've all watched. And it's really not easy at all. So, the first thing is to be able to even identify what we mean by sanitation and the various strands that come within the idea of sanitation. I don't know how many years ago it was when Sujit came up with this thing saying that women are having a problem in the rural areas because they don't have toilets, and there are all kinds of legal issues that come up in this. How do we think about it? And I think you've been thinking about it for a really long time. The interesting thing about sanitation is that it didn't used to be something that you spoke of at the dining table. But in the past 20 years that has changed. We can talk about it. We can actually have an evening when it doesn't seem odd that we are talking about sanitation. Of course, we sanitize the term, we call it sanitation, but we are actually talking about something much more everyday. And I've been told that 4-letter words are proscribed here, so I'm not going to use it, but you know what I'm talking about. I'll request Justice Madan Loku to tell us what he's seen in the book, and then Abdendra Sharan, then I'll come in at the end, because this is actually agenda setting. It's not just producing a book. It is acknowledging an agenda that existed, and it is setting the agenda for the number of things that need to be done. It tells us how much we know. The book tells us how much we know today, but it also tells us that there are so many things that we've not even been able to think of because it's not been part of our discourse over all these years. So Justice Loku?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Philippines Sujit for an excellent book that they've come out with. I must confess I haven't gone through the entire 300, 400 pages, but I've gone through at least half of it. And what I found was I was looking at it from the perspective of a judge who's been involved in public interest litigation. What I found was that we tend to look at judges and lawyers. We tend to look at things dealing with public interest in a very legalistic sort of a manner. So one example which has come out in this book is, are there any manual scavengers in Delhi, for example? And in the case that was filed, the government of Delhi said there are no manual scavengers in Delhi. Why? Because they said that the definition of a manual scavenger is that somebody who carries this four-letter word on his or her head. And these people do not carry that four-letter word on their head, they carry it on the side. So therefore there are no manual scavengers. So if you look at it from a very legalistic point of view, you tend to go completely off track. And I think one of the important lessons that I found from this book was that you have to look at issues of public interest, issues concerning social justice in a far larger context than they have been looked at. So when you talk about sanitation and why we need to get rid of manual scavenging, why we need to have improved sanitation and so on and so forth, is because it touches upon a variety of issues. It touches upon education. So if there's no clean water, for example, people are likely to fall sick. So kids miss school. And again, at some place it is said that something like 443 million days of school have been missed out. You're looking at health, not only of children but also adults. If you don't have sanitary surroundings, hygienic surroundings, people are likely to fall sick. So it's a whole range of issues that you have to look at. That is one very important lesson that comes out very strongly in this book. The second lesson that comes out, and which I felt actually while sitting as a judge, was that we need the assistance of NGOs or of people who are actually working in the field as much as we need the assistance of lawyers. Of course, lawyers will take you from a legal point of view, but unless you have persons who are actually working on the field, NGOs, civil society persons, you won't get the correct picture. Why I say that is that we had dealt with one case of child marriages, and the lawyer who appeared was also working with an NGO, and she was very well versed in the subject of child marriages because that was one of the areas that the NGO was looking at, and she gave us this broad perspective of what child marriages actually involves, and we were able to understand the case much better and appreciate what the problems are. Now this book looks at the entire range of issues, like I mentioned, education, health, and so many other issues, housing, stigma, so on and so forth, from the ground level. So you're actually getting a very broad picture of what sanitation is all about, what it entails. Forget about the legal definition of sanitation or manual scavenging or whatever. So you get a good idea of what it's all about and what are the problems, and importantly, what are the solutions. Now there are two things. You see, one is that the something that happens can be so gross that it's impossible to find a solution for people like you and me. It's for the government or the state to find a solution. So in public interest litigation, you may come across a situation where something very gross happens. Like many years ago, you had the blinding of some persons who were alleged to be criminals. Acid was poured into their eyes, needles were pierced into their eyes, and so on. So what can we do about it? We can't do anything about it, but it's really the state which has something to do about it. So something which is very gross and beyond our capacity as individuals is something which public interest litigation will highlight. That's one aspect of public interest litigation or social action litigation. The other aspect is that there is a problem. It may be gross, but these are the possible solutions. So this book actually is in the second category, that there is a problem, but it also tells you that these are the possible solutions. And one of them, which I subscribe to, is a lack of implementation. So you may have good laws, you may have a law in 1993, you may have a law in 2013, you may have judgments of the Supreme Court, but who's going to implement them? So the solution is implement the laws, but then ultimately you come back, to square one and say, well, who has to implement it? It's the government or the state which has to implement the laws. And if they don't do it, what is a citizen supposed to do, or what is a manual scavenger supposed to do, or what are these women in the rural area supposed to do if the state does not implement these laws? So I think, it's as far as I'm concerned, the judgments of the Supreme Court that have been dealt with over here, two important judgments, they take you in a particular direction, but just leave you there. Because in one of these chapters, chapter 11, for example, the 2014 judgment, it's been 5 years now, 2014 or 2013, 2014 judgment, it's been 5 years now, and it's said very clearly that it's not been implemented. So what does one do? So these are, I think, issues which are very, very important. Sanitation certainly is a very important issue, far more important than I had actually imagined. Let me be frank about it. So I think we have to find some solutions and make sure that the laws are implemented, judgments of the Supreme Court are implemented. You can't, I believe, you can't just say that, well, this is what the Supreme Court has said, and that's it. For example, in 2014, the Supreme Court says that for every death you have to give 10 lakhs. Is it being given? There are still, if I remember the figures, about 119 persons who have not got the benefit of the judgment of the Supreme Court. Why is that? And who is supposed to implement it? I mean, are the petitioners supposed to implement it? Are you and I supposed to implement it? Who's supposed to implement it? So these are, I think, very important issues that have been raised in this book, and really, thanks a lot for doing this excellent work.
Thank you, Justice Loku. I just want to say a few things in this context, because there was this kind of note of anxiety bordering on despondency in the idea of implementation. I think, the first law, the 1993 law, did not come because the state was looking to enact it. It came because there was a pressure from the crowd. The case came to the court after the movement had begun, and the movement was unable to get the state to move. So they came to the court to assist them in the work that they did. So this is one extraordinary case where actually we've been saying that it's a pity that Bezoda Wilson is not here today. But the Safai Karmchari Andolan movement here and across the country, various groups who worked on it, have not put the burden on the court or the state to make sure that this gets done. They are making sure that the court and the state act. So it's been one of those extraordinary things where the case first went to the court in 2003. And like you said about the Delhi affidavit, there were many state governments came to the court and said that we don't have manual scavenging. And it would have ended there if the movement grew with the case. Because every time they would come to the court and say nothing is, we don't have them, the movement would go, there were volunteers all across the country who would go to various places, take photographs of the people who are actually doing the work, get whole pro formas filled up, get them to say what it was that was happening with them, record it and bring it back to the court, so that there were many judges who were saying, surely in this time and age we don't have manual scavenging. So it was difficult for them to believe, because like we often see, this is one area where it is silent, and your manual scavengers are not to be seen. They're just supposed to come through the back door, do their work and go away. So nobody acknowledges the existence of this. So it was one of those phenomenal things that we've been saying we need to do a bit of writing on this, which we tentatively, and Pasha is going to give me a thing for this, which we call the anatomy of a case and the biography of a movement. Because the between 2003 and 2014, the court has no idea how much it assisted the movement. And the court has no idea how much the movement had to work to get the court to assist the movement. So I think there are fascinating stories to tell in this, which tells us it's not just about an NGO or a movement, but it's about, you know, till 1997, 98, nobody talked about manual scavenging. And today, there is no newspaper, there is no policy document, there is no public conversation that happens without acknowledging manual scavenging. It's a huge shift. And it's not just the 1993 law and the 2013 law. Apart from the case, we've also had it now introduced as an atrocity into the Atrocities Act of 89. So like they say, it's like you can go into the sewer and die because you're dispensable anyway, and your life doesn't matter. Now those lives have been, all of us have been forced to acknowledge that those lives matter. And that's a huge thing that the movement has done. All we very often ask of the court is that it acknowledges what fundamental rights are. And that when people are working for it, you assist the people in working on the ground so that we can make some kind of shift. And it happened in this case. So although it's true that it hasn't completely gone away after 2014, the existence of that case has helped the movement along. And the movement will perhaps go back to the court because the court does have a certain role and a certain responsibility, and they'll draw on it to get them to act. But this is this has been one, I won't say whether it's a good story or a bad story, but extraordinary story of persistence, of courage and conviction, in which the court has played a very significant part. So we're actually grateful to that extent that the court exists. Sometimes we worry, but
I do acknowledge the fact that the court has taken, has played a very major role. But I feel that, it shouldn't just stop there, because at one point of time, if you remember in the case, it was suggested that let it go to the high courts.
it did go.
It did go, okay. And they said that, listen, we can't handle it, Deswada, Wilson, and those who were with him. So I hope, that if at all it has to go back to the Supreme Court doesn't say, listen, just go to the high courts. We can't handle it.
Yeah, no, that danger always exists.
That's what I'm a little afraid of, actually.
No, but we hope that high courts do act. We want them to be active.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at the budget this time, I think it's almost like a competitive, talking about technology, because the kind of questions they ask is this: that you can send a rocket to the moon, you can have Chandrayaan, any other irons you want, but it's not possible to send. You still have to be sending people under the ground. Why is this that? It's never been a priority to have this technology, and since nobody did anything, the movement picked it up itself. There are many volunteers. People really care. This country is not made of people who don't care. So people who cared and who had technical know-how came in and offered their services for free and said, we'll devise these machines for you. And now you have governments going to all these people and with full support and understanding from the movement. So now you find in the budget that the government suddenly says that we are going to bring in technologies for working. This is one, again it's extraordinary because you've had the government having to learn, being compelled to learn from what a movement does. So there are stories like that to tell in this.
Just fine.
No, formally.
Well, I hope so. No, thank you first for inviting me, because I have no background in law and no expertise in matters of law. So I have something to say about sanitation, on which I've done some work. To go back to the four-letter word first,
You can use it
there's
as
a
a joke.
there's a statement that I came across about a decade back when I was researching something else, which said, "Shit when written does not smell." It's only when you have to speak about it that you encounter problems. And just hold on to that thought. I'll come back to that at the end of my remarks. Because there's a difficulty in speaking about it. My first comment is a big congratulations to the editors, not only for producing this very important collection of essays, but also from refraining from a heavy editorial hand that would have bound them into a singular frame. There is only one singular frame in this, which is that any right to sanitation which does not consider the right of sanitation workers is the poorer frame. So you cannot have a right to sanitation which is not also simultaneously about the rights of sanitation workers. And this is also understandable because, as Usha said, sanitation is a difficult word to fix. It has both a narrower sense and a more wider sense of it. And in several of the essays in this book, you encounter both senses of it. The most telling one is in South Africa, where in 2 consecutive years you come up with 2 different definitions. The first focused on the entire sewerage network, and the second which is only or largely about toilets alone. And that's also features in many of the essays on India. Philip's own essay, for instance, asks this question, is it okay if we just talk about toilets? And his own answer is in the negative. It does create a problem not to have this fixity, especially in policy terms. For instance, if my reading of the comments on the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan or mission is right, then the suggestion is that they have got fixated on the toilets. And that means the funds will largely flow in that direction. And so it does have a policy implications, sometimes perverse, if you stick to a very narrow meaning. However, my own sense is that for purposes of research, this is not a problem, to have these different meanings of the word sanitation. So if you take the narrower definition of sanitation in the Swachh Bharat Mission guidelines, for instance, which is fixated on toilets, you can still ask a lot of interesting questions as a researcher. Some of the questions randomly taken from different essays, for example, there are questions on specific sites for provision of toilets in different geographical settings, inside homes and within communities, at schools and marketplaces. There are essays that draw attention to public utilities such as railways and examine the power dynamics that enable or disable access to particular groups. For instance, privileging teachers within schools over students, or citing toilets in ways that makes it very difficult for women to access it. So there are questions to be asked even within this narrower definition of what is happening with toilets and what can you read of them. Some of the essays bring into question issues of design and standards. They bring into question issues of menstrual hygiene, and they certainly bring into question issues of caste and power dynamics, which has to do with architecture and housing design, which permits those who will clean the toilet ostensibly on behalf of others, having to go through only particular doors and not others. So there's a range of issues that even that narrow definition opens up. If you go even narrower, say for example, on sanitation workers, there's a clear sense that on one issue, it's an absolute no, which is on manual scavenging. Whereas there are other aspects where technology and modernization and those kind of things might have a role to play. There are details about whether water facilities are available or not, whether there's ventilation or not. And so there's a lot of things to talk about the micro-politics of toilet construction. And that's something that's highlighted in at least one essay, which I'll come to at the end of the remarks. And it's very important to stay with that meaning also. Having said that, there's little denying that most of the authors in this volume feel that sanitation must be seen in its larger sense, which deals with everything from collection to transport and eventual disposal. Also brings into view environmental aspects, gender dimensions of sanitary practices, or develop more nuanced understanding of what constitutes infrastructure. Infrastructure is both physical and symbolic. This is what, not to embarrass you, but to simply to cite you from another essay that you wrote a long time back, which is, this brings into view other communities of risk. And it's been a very integral to how one thinks about sanitation and sanitation policies. Uh, Let me give you just some odd historical examples. In the 1860s, you already have a report on drainage in Calcutta, which is talking about municipal authorities permitting night soil to be dumped into the river, and this causing a problem for those who access the river for drinking water. A couple of decades down the line, Banaras tries to build an underground sewerage system. This time it is Calcutta that protests, that every person who lives downstream from Banaras is at risk, especially in the cities where large numbers of people are living. And this goes on over a long period of time. What kind of sewage can be discharged into rivers? Do you need to treat it? What's the best method of treating it? What are the new technologies that you bring into play? This has been, for instance, in Lovelin's own essay, this aspect of it has been dealt with. But as Loveleen says, and I'm afraid in this volume also, this does remain a marginal presence, this whole environmental dimension of the issue. There are other issues that have been taken up, which more fully. For instance, in Matthew John's essay on urban sanitation, you get a lot on the state's obligation to provide services. And it begins with a discussion of the famous Ratlam case, in which Justice Krishna Iyer famously ruled that the state is obliged to provide these services irrespective of whether they have the money or not. And then goes on to discuss other issues, including in the contemporary, mostly around Article 21, which is the right to life. But as both John has argued and as Usha has argued in her foreword, this is not an unmixed blessing. And especially when courts under Article 21 send out a more prejudiced view of the urban poor and also the rural poor. And most famously, with regard to sanitation, in the Milta Patel case, about which you write, and I'm going to quote you, this judgment marks a definitive shift in reimagining the public in public interest, even as it lays blame and the city's shame on those too poor to be legal. And this is a remark that all of us have to kind of think deeply about. Who's too poor to be legal in this country? And why do courts display this prejudice in some of their rulings at least? Now, so sanitation, as I said, one could do research both with its narrower sense and with its larger sense. And in this book, you get essays which tend to, or at least attempt to both, but obviously different authors have different issues that they deal with more fully. On the question of rights, and I'm not a lawyer, so bear with me, my comments are rather simple, which is, as the opening essay points out, the right to sanitation can be read off or read in conjunction with several other rights. And this Lokul also spoke of this: right to education, right to adequate standard of living, right to housing, right to work, right to dignity, right to physical security, any number of rights in conjunction with the right to sanitation. And Article 21, of course. And then Sujit in his essays points out there were several statutes on labor legislation, on differently abled people, laws governing Panchayati Raj institutions, in all of which in some way or the other issues of sanitation figure. And several issues attach themselves to this consideration. One, as I just mentioned, is whose rights are we talking about? And it's clear that the answer is not easy as far as that question is concerned. About households, there is possibly some clarity, but regarding migrant workers, regarding those who live on railway tracks, it's very difficult to think about whose rights are we talking about. It is also for us to consider whether securing rights in one domain may come into conflict with rights in other domains. So the essay on the right to sanitation, rights of sanitation workers, for instance, observes that while the local authorities are obliged to maintain a clean environment, there is nothing in the statutes that obliges them to look after the health and safety of the workers. And the right, there's no legal mechanism to ensure safety and health of sanitation workers. Now, in my view, this is a kind of comparative assessment that could have been pushed further. To ask, for instance, whether the right to health has a greater potential to be socially inclusive than, say, the right to environment. And there's a case that can be made about that. So you could address environmental issues perhaps more fully even through a right to health. Or does the right to housing retains the possibility for auto construction have more to offer, including regarding household toilets, than one which promises building of a fixed design? And this is one of the essays of Gautam Bhan. He's made a case why auto construction works better for poor. So the comparative dimensions to be considered, which I thought more could have been done in this book itself, but it's something that hopefully others will take up in other works. On the other hand, I think the essays collectively do a wonderful job of establishing that while enunciation of rights is one thing, realizing them is quite another. And this is a point you made, and it's a point that several essays made, most fully in the last essay on gender and inequality, where questions of privacy and dignity, though written into the Constitution, have not quite been realized on the ground. And the authors offer some sense of why this failure to implement has happened, including fragmentation of statutory framework, institutional overlaps, lack of capacity at municipal level, lack of community participation. Several reasons have been offered across the essays, and this failure to implement it seems to be a big part of several essays. Is something I'm trying to think about. How does one think about failure to implement? Because almost all policy documents, not almost all, several policy documents almost presume a failure to implement. So if you look at planning documents, urban planning documents for instance, they begin by assuming that there will be a failure of implementation. In that case, how does one think about this failure? Is it something that there were good intentions that could not be realized, or is it something about the design of policy that we have to think about? Finally, let me come to the one issue that I think both figures in this book and certainly deserves far more attention than possibly has been given here, which is on the question of aesthetics. Several of the contributors have pointed out much of the current policy is demand driven, and as part of that it focuses on behavioral change. So people have to change their behavior and how they work, and how they lead their lives, etc. My own sense is that this is one of the most difficult and fraught areas. The British, when they first introduced sanitation in India, declared it to be a Western science, and all of us natives had no clue to it, and we had to change our behavior. That golden moment has passed, but it is plausible to suggest that we have replaced it with another hierarchy, where the urban middle class decides what is okay and what is not. And that is something that we need to engage with, because urban middle class notions of dirt and cleanliness, dignity and disgust, have taken a hold of how we imagine issues of sanitation, among many other issues. And so I do not discount the fact, as several authors have pointed out, that there are massive health costs to open defecation, and that there are issues of safety there. I have absolutely no doubt that in the shadow of those concerns lurks this whole business of the image of the nation. So what we should be ashamed of, which is the failure of the state to provide the facilities, instead gets translated in being ashamed of the practices of the poor. And this has a long history that has gone on for at least a century. And then we take our models. It used to be once cities of the West, probably now cities of the Southeast Asia or villages of elsewhere, China, name it. This is brilliantly brought out in a book that some of you would be familiar with, Asha Ghatna's book on Delhi called Ruled by Aesthetics, where it looks at this whole discourse of aesthetics and making of these aesthetic choices. Unfortunately, this finds mention in several essays, but this hasn't quite been made central, despite the recognition that several of the publicity programs that go along with this whole business of change of behavior, in the name of providing toilets, actually are reinscribing patriarchal norms. And you can hear this on the radio, you can watch it on television. These are very serious concerns that one hopes future research will take, say something about. I also wish, not simply because I'm trained as a historian, that one did longer historical inquiry about these things, because notions, cultural and social notions about self, personhood, dignity, shame, body, infrastructure, they change slowly and in a very subtle way. The only hint that we get here is a quote from a work by M.N. Srinivas, which says that till the 1940s, both bathing in the open and defecating in the open was a social activity, with no sense of shame attached to it. And he says it was possible because the corporeal self and the social self were distinguished. Now that's the only statement that we get about how notions of body and things about disgust and safety and visibility could possibly have been imagined in other times. In the contemporary, the only essay in this book that addresses it is the essay by Renu Desai and Colin, this third author there, which is on Bombay, which is an ethnographic study of how middle-class notions of shame and disgust are very different from what the urban poor of Bombay get disgusted by, which is the smells and the dirt inside the toilets that they're supposed to use, rather than the open spaces that some of them are compelled to use. So there's something to be said there. I'm convinced that that any thoughts around right to sanitation would have to take into account the fact that this is both socially and spatially differentiated, both in its promise and its realization. It's not simply in its realization. Even in its promise, there is a lot to think about, whether it builds and further deepens these social cleavages, or it actually does something else. As I said, hopefully there would be other works which would elaborate on this sense of difference, in ideas about how to deal with the issue.
Thank you very much. Especially because I think the editors of this book and many of the contributors are lawyers, and there are many parts of learning that we miss completely. So we need to have our attention drawn to it. And it's extremely good to make lawyers feel a little small. We feel pretty confident and cocky a lot of the time.
You make us feel afraid I have to write the damn thing.
Yeah. No, we like a little fear in our social scientists. But I was actually amused because you kept saying, I am not a lawyer when you talked about rights. And I was thinking the hardest thing to do very often when we are when we take matters like this, either to the courts especially, it's not just the judges. It's very difficult to get the lawyers to see the rights aspects of these things. And to tell them that human rights lawyering is not about converting the case into language that is convenient to be communicated to judges, but that you've got to take the politics of the movement into the court, or of the issue into the court. It's extremely difficult to do human rights lawyering in that sense. So I think actually lawyers have a huge difficulty in understanding rights. So the next time you can stop being apologetic about it. It doesn't matter at all. In fact, one of the strangest, the judge too is a lawyer, so one of the most disturbing cases that we had in recent times was a judgment in a case where, just for the Haryana elections and the kind of qualifications that
disqualification measures. Yeah.
and when you see that, for instance, if you don't have a toilet, then you can't stand for elections. If you've not done up to your 10 standard, you can't stand for elections. And the one statement in that judgment is especially striking, where the justice was not in relation to toilets but in relation to education, says that it is education that tells people the difference between right and wrong. And I was wondering if it was education that had taught the judge that, and how wrong he was in what he was saying. And how much, many of you are very young, but those of you who are not that young, 45 years ago, if you were going on public transport or if you're taking a rickshaw from somewhere to school, everybody spoke philosophy. Today everyone's on the phone and it's just a destroyed world. But everybody spoke philosophy. So it was like, they would spout it like it was most natural to them. And the rawer the person who are unclouded by the kind of education that we have, the more witty the philosophy that would emerge from them. So I think this, there are many things that that are prejudices that we carry with us and how we look at it, and you've helped tell us the places where we are actually missing what we ought to be seeing and shed those shutters that have only kept a certain set of things in. So that's extremely helpful. And the one other thing that I found is that in the past 20, 30 years, see, the problem with a book is that only those who can write end up being in the book. I think they've also made an effort to find those who don't write to at least speak to them so that it gets written. And there is a more effort being put in that kind of thing now, where people who have experience, people who live that life, are just allowed to speak. It's not. I mean, there's a part of that here, but we're doing more and more of that, even when we're doing legal writing, where we are saying that there is no way that we can understand certain experiences. We cannot understand what it will be like to be in a situation where we are so hungry that we might starve to death. We cannot understand what it means to be a person who's forced to, or who lands up in a life begging, because we don't know what that level of indignity, that level of want which drives you there. It's impossible to imagine it. It's impossible to empathize. Just like it has been impossible for us to see what happens when someone goes down a sewer line. So, and this, so how do we then create that empathy? Because if you're not hearing other voices, and very often people experience things without necessarily being able to give a language to it. So even if we said, okay, let's record what's being said, it may not come in the way in which it is experienced, because a lot of the time, pain and suffering have to be converted into something else for life to continue. So how much do we miss in that? And I found that in sanitation especially, because we are trying the kind of shifts, because of many of the things that both of you have actually said, that we presume that it is a program when it is actually about the lives of people and the rights of people. And this is not a program. So if we are able to shake that off and see this as something that should involve people and not be imposed on people, because I know what is good for you, which is what your comment was about too. That we know best what is needed for this, for you, because we need it for the country. And if you don't do it, then you're not just not conforming to what we are asking you to do, but it's close to criminality of a certain order, which we need to punish. To get out of this paradigm, I think a lot more literature like this needs to be produced. I mean, because we need to learn as people who've been taught to read and write and to think and to explore and to investigate. There's a whole load of learning to be done, which in this field especially is just beginning. And the reason that I found this fascinating was also because there are very few areas where research and writing has focused on people who, for the longest time, have not mattered. Suddenly they've begun to matter. I think they've begun to matter for the wrong reason as far as the state is concerned, but for completely the right reason from movements. So these parallel lines ever meet. And if they meet, what happens to them? That's going to be, I think, what we see over the next few years. I'll stop with that, Mr. Jay. Yes, of course.
This is in the context of criminality that you mentioned. Today's papers, for example, say that nobody has been prosecuted. At least that's what was said in the Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha or something. Nobody has been prosecuted for the crime which is there in the statute. Maybe a couple of contractors have been fined, but nobody has been prosecuted as such. I think that is one area that needs to be looked at, because the laws provide for bureaucrats, the executive, to do some things, right? If they don't do it, what happens? I mean, a person goes to court and says, listen, they're not doing their job. That's what public interest litigation is about. But how about penalizing the persons who are supposed to do their job but are not doing it? Can we prosecute them? And if we can, why are we not doing it? Send a couple of these guys to jail. Persons who are supposed to have these plans plans made out, appointments made, and so on and so forth. I remember in the this Food Security Act, the Food Security Commission was not set up in Maharashtra for several months. And the affidavit that came from the state of Maharashtra was that we've not been able to find a suitable scheduled caste person to appoint. Now, there are a couple of million scheduled caste persons in Maharashtra and they can't find one guy. You know, so I think we should look at criminality of the persons who are supposed to do their job under the law but are not doing their job under the law.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to respond to which is, the thing that strikes me of much that comes under this kind of a, broadly speaking, development philosophy is that there are two options. One is either we can discover our future, which means the future has already happened elsewhere. We must be able to imitate quite properly. Or we could build our future. Now, this building of the future is a difficult game for the reason that the essay particularly struck me was because even to describe what you're saying in a manner that is adequate to the reality that you're saying is so difficult because even our descriptive terms are borrowed. So in that one, for instance, one of the interesting things that the authors do is they don't take a normative stance on open defecation. Instead, they look at the context in which those choices are being made and what those choices mean for the people who are making those choices. And I think that is what allows them to enter the life worlds of the people that they're hoping to describe. So, of course, interviews with people who have those experiences is one, but this kind of a very rich ethnography also serves a huge purpose.
I'm sorry, I was shutting the session down because I've been told that Justice Malundokku needed to leave early. He's given us some time. So if there's anything from the floor, and please speak. Yes, please. If you could introduce yourself.
I'm Suresh Panjay, a journalist. But I have 3 points to mention, and I would very much want your reaction to this. At the outset, before implementing the right to sanitation, don't you feel that it's a policy of a cart before the horse? First of all, we have to inculcate civic sense among all. That is one. And the second is about the you mentioned about the outsourcing of, there are cases of outsourcing of sanitation work to contractors. And the government expects the contractor to pay the sanitary workers through the bank, whereas the sanitary workers, they are daily wage earners, they don't have any bank account, and thereby their payment is held up. And the third is about the Calcutta case you mentioned, Dhapa. There is a place called Dhapa in Calcutta where entire sewerage of Calcutta is to outflow, and it was a place which was known for the best of the cauliflowers. So on these 3 aspects, I wish to have your comments, please.
Well, cauliflowers is the simplest one because you throw out your waste, it goes to some farmer's field. It's rich in nutrients. They shift what they have to cultivate that cauliflower or palak or whatever, which gives more money. It comes back to your dining table, and the cycle is completed. So we throw out our industrial waste, domestic waste, whatever it is, and the cycle is neatly completed when it comes back on our table.
Okay, all of you, I know you're fasting this evening.
Wash it.
I think I need to call us now for dinner today. I feel that's just something on the table.
Yeah, anybody? Yeah.
My name is Bhasha. I'm a journalist and writer and working on the issue. Just when Usha started that some words, especially about the shit, I just wanted to put 3 words here. That's shit, caste and patriarchy. When we are discussing about right to sanitation in India and how they are intermingled, and I think in this book that work has been done very well and in a very different phenomena. I just want to share one of my experience. Just now I'm working in Patna in few of the slums. तो मुझे लगा कि अभी जो आपने बात कही, it's ready, कि वहाँ पर जो सैनिटेशन का पर्सपेक्टिव है, वहाँ पे जो ओपन डेफिकेशन का पर्सपेक्टिव है, और एक्टिविस्ट हों, स्कॉलर्स हों, लॉयर्स हों, सबके हिसाब से भी जब जो बस्तियाँ जहाँ पे लोग काम कर रहे हैं, जो सफाई कर्मचारियों की बस्तियाँ हैं, पूरे देश में, यहाँ तक कि दिल्ली सहित तमाम देश में कहीं भी टॉयलेट्स नहीं, मेजॉरिटी में वो सबसे पहले डिप्राइव्ड हैं टॉयलेट से, और वहाँ उनके लिए ओडीएफ इतना बड़े मज़ेदार ढंग से वो उसको मजाक उड़ाते हैं और वो बताते हैं कि किस तरह से उनको खुले में जाना ही पड़ता है। हालांकि इस बात में जो अर्बन पुअर है वो चाहता है कि उसे एक फैसिलिटी मिले, और जहाँ फैसिलिटी मिल रही है उसे पैसा देना पड़ रहा है। तो एक चीज़ तो मुझे लगता है कि जब भी हम सैनिटेशन पे चर्चा करें तो ये जो 3 शब्द जिनसे हमें बहुत परहेज होता है, भारत में इसके बिना चर्चा, इन 3 शब्दों के बिना, चाहे वो शिट हो, चाहे वो कास्ट हो, चाहे पेट्रियार्की हो, इसका बहुत गहरा संबंध है। और पॉलिसी मेकर्स और लॉयर्स के बीच में जब तक इसके प्रति एक हम एक्सेप्टेबिलिटी नहीं बनाते कि अगर हम बात करना चाहते हैं। दूसरा जो एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट इशू मुझे लगता है जो इस बुक में भी डिस्कस्ड है और उस पर थोड़ा सा और काम तमाम और साथी भी करें, दैट सैनिटेशन इज द फर्स्ट वर्क विच वॉज गॉन टू द कॉन्ट्रैक्टर्स। आज भी जितनी सीवर डेथ्स होती हैं, जो आपने क्रिमिनलिटी की बात की, उसमें सबसे बड़ी मुश्किल होती है कि कौन दोषी है। वो जूनियर लेवल का कॉन्ट्रैक्टर है, क्योंकि सारी जो डेथ्स हैं मेजॉरिटी, अगर सीवेज ट्रीटमेंट प्लान को छोड़ दीजिए तो जितनी डेथ्स हो रही हैं अक्रॉस द कंट्री, वो ठेकेदार है जिस ठेकेदार को उसने सबलेट किया हुआ है, और वो कुछ लोगों को हायर करता है। अभी दिल्ली में पूरी दिल्ली, आधी दिल्ली जो है उधाड़ी हुई है, सब जगह नालियों की सफाई चल रही है, और आप पाएंगे कि कानून कहीं इम्प्लीमेंटेड नहीं है, सारे लोगों को ड्रेन्स पे वैसे ही जाना पड़ रहा है, उसी तरह से लोग उतर रहे हैं। तो इस पे एक जो बहुत बड़ा पब्लिक कॉन्शियसनेस की पॉलिसी मेकर्स पर असर पड़े, जज और कोर्ट कैसे एक्ट करता है, उषा और बाकी और सब लोगों से बेहतर कोई नहीं जानता कि वो किस तरह से उनको सेंसिटाइज करने में इतने साल लगे, 2003 से लेके 2014 तक का जो सफर था। लेकिन अभी भी जो हम कुछ इम्पॉर्टेंट इशू से कि मर लोग रहे हैं या हत्याएं हो रही हैं, इसलिए क्योंकि सैनिटेशन कास्ट लिंक्ड है। लोग आज भी जब हम आप बात कर रहे हैं 1.6 लाख महिलाएं मैला ढो रही हैं क्योंकि ये सैनिटेशन कास्ट बेस्ड है। तो ये जो चीज़ें हैं, जिस भी तरह से, जिस भी लैंग्वेजेस में जितनी ज़्यादा इन पर बातचीत हो, जितनी ज़्यादा इस पर हम खुल के बात करें, बिना कोई हेजिटेशन के बात करें, मुझे लगता है कि उतना ही बेहतर रहेगा।
Hi, good evening, respected quorum and the respected audience. As the Lordship rightly pointed out, that the executive needs to implement the policies which will help into curtail of this open defecation. But we have missed out the third pillar of our democracy, that is the journalism, which can bring it into the public domain, which will also bring the knowledge about it, not amongst the policy makers, but also who are really affected by it. The common people who lives in the deprived slums, who live in a very deprived situations, how they can be sensitized about the benefits of it and about the demerits of open defecation. And all these policies which are made in the closed rooms, they should be implemented in the open ground with the help of the journalists, with the help of the college students who can go out and spread the word amongst all the journal people. And that's how I think that one more thing could be added up in the betterment of the society at large. Thank you.
best what is for them. You're presuming policymakers know best what should happen with people. Maybe we should also consider this, that perhaps people know best what is good for them. We found very often in many of our poverty studies that there is an infantilizing of persons in various conditions of poverty. That is, we presume that if you're poor, you never attain adulthood. You can't think for yourself, you can't make decisions for yourself, you can't be autonomous, and therefore there's no, decisions just need to be imposed on you. Maybe we need to be a little careful about how we think about interactions of various categories, classes, of communities, before we make these presumptions. I mean, maybe they shouldn't be presumptions at all. So while I agree with you, the journalists, that writing about it is extremely important, I think it's also significant that for the longest time, even sewer deaths were never reported in the newspapers. It needed a movement from the ground, and for it to become something that could be news before it could even appear in the papers. So there's a lot of learning that journalists and college students need to do from local communities. And if we acknowledge the mutual learning, we might end up with a better result than if we were just to presume that we know and we need to therefore enforce it. Just as a suggestion.
I completely agree with you, ma'am, on that. But my point was not about the presumption. I was putting that college students should be sent to these places, and in fact, these seminars which we organize in the colleges, we should encourage those students who are more active, who are more inclined towards bring a change in the society. So they should be encouraged to go out and spread the word. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make a quick point about, or rather a question on, so if we look at sanitation as a right, is it correct to reduce it to something which becomes target based for an executive to achieve? So I think there was an incident in Rajasthan where a district collector beat up a man who was trying, and I think he was trying to take pictures of women who were defecating in the open because he had some targets to achieve, to show these many toilets he had made or these many. So is it, I can understand that in some context perhaps fixing accountability for implementing a certain right, making it target based might make sense. But does it make sense in case of sanitation?
I think one of the chapters does deal with this. In fact, one of the horrendous cases was where school teachers were told that they have to mark their attendance by taking photographs, selfies, with a person who's defecating in the open, to say that that they've done their job of making sure that people are shamed. So in fact, this one of the contexts in which we're considering this now is what Justice Lokur also referred, which is this between right and shame, and you were also talking about the idea that something that, and actually everybody said it, that Yamini too said this, that something that is about people and people's rights and that people's ability to get what they see themselves as needing has got converted into some kind of a national shame if you don't use the toilet. So there is something in the book on that. If I can, yeah.
So I'm Shama Gurekos. I'm working with Didi. So basically, there was this question on like the comment which you made on judgments and then implementation. So is it also, we have always seen that there are a lot of great judgments that have come which have been radical and they've set the norm, especially in the development sectors, so be it environment, be it education, and like things like this. But there is always an implementation issue when it comes to it. So there was a point later mentioned about normative interpretation, and are judges or the judiciary affected by that interpretation? Is that one of the reasons why implementation may be a challenge? I mean, it's just a query that we have, because we're working on the project, like we're working on something to know why implementation is problematic, and is this one such reason? Is it possible?
I wouldn't just limit it to that. I mean, there are several things that happen when a judgment is delivered. I'm talking about public interest litigation, not about civil suits and all that. There's a lot that goes into it, in the sense that you have inputs coming from the petitioner, you have inputs coming from the state, and you're trying to find common ground. Now, as has been noted in this book, the state says that, listen, we are doing a very good job. You know, why are you telling us that you're not doing a good job? So that's where implementation becomes a problem. You know, so, or it could be going in the wrong direction. You know, saying that, well, the best way to get to solve the problem of you know, right to sanitation is to build toilets. So you decide that you're going to build 1 lakh toilets. But then there are other issues that go along with building toilets. Availability of water, you know, and it has been mentioned over here, availability of soap, you know, things like that. So that's where the problem of implementation comes in. It's not only, you know, definitions or you know, a narrow thing, but it's definitely something much broader than that. Yeah.
I can only speak as a researcher, and one of the things that one looks for is, see, much of public policy has philosophical underpinnings. And those are not the things that we look at. So, whether it's reservation, whether it's, you know, whatever it is, the issues about equality, about dignity, about privacy, whether it's Aadhaar judgment. And my sense is, if we took the philosophical underpinnings more seriously, we'll probably have a richer debate on why things go the way they do. And which is not to say about practical implementation questions are not there to be tackled. But that ignorance costs us very dear. We neither train our students in it. We certainly don't do ourselves as researchers. And it's something that I have felt for some time has made our discussions poor. So if we don't understand philosophical underpinnings of equality, and certainly its more nuanced, more particular expressions, you could debate on reservation for years on end without getting to the heart of it.
I can call upon Sujit to give us the vote. Thanks and then.
Yes. Final word. That is one advantage of having Usha on board, because she got off and kicked us the baton. So we are now, Philip is out of the schedule, and we are winding it up.
Since I break rules all the time, Sujit, sit down.
So I think we failed to obey.
He never speaks, so I don't think we want to speak to the guy.
Yeah, so now I think many of us, if not all, are almost ready to leave. So I'm just three things. I mean, before I don't think of saying a formal gratitude of thanks, so that I will put it in very generic terms. But for doing that, I think just point out three very quick points. Like, I mean, just in case if that prompts us to open this book, because one is even though there has been quite a lot of work on sanitation when we started this, our specific idea was to look at it from a right perspective. And why that is important, because we as a group believe that sanitation indeed is a site of quite a lot of violence, denial of rights, violation of rights, and at the same time there's a huge resistance against this violation from the violator. So from all these things, then it makes sense not to look at sanitation completely as a program, as like the panelists and everyone really said. So instead, I think we probably need to look at it from different perspective also. It's not an exclusive perspective, but an additional thing, an additional language which we are trying to inject into the discourse. And the second point is, like, again, this is hardly any solution. Like, I mean, we are not prescribing anything in this book, and the authors are not prescribing anything in this book. Instead, what we are trying to do is, or hoping to do is, to problematize it further and to convey a message that this is a complex issue and it is wrong to imagine this as a simple issue. And third point is the methodology itself. It's like quite a mixture of methodologies that different authors have followed, with some of these as particularly this one chapter, which is a narrative based. So what we done, and this is not so common in the academic world, but this is what makes this book a little more interesting in terms of some of these things are based on grounded experiences and personal narratives. So for that matter, I think together, we really hope that at least some of us will find it interesting to open this book and engage with this substance. And then moving to my formal duty, we really thank Center for Policy Research to make this happen, and for Yamini to open this event, and Justice Loco, Professor Saran, and Usha for making and breaking the pattern, and all of us who are here. And we really, in addition to this physical presence, we really hope that you will have some time to engage